With us on this panel, we have Mike Calabrese from the New America Foundation, Harold Feld from the Media Access Project, Ben Scott from Free Press, and Greg Goldman from Wireless Philadelphia, our special guest star, and they are doing some really, really cool things in Philadelphia. Actually, let's put him on the spot and start off with Greg. Why don't you come up to the podium and do your thing?
All right. Thanks, Maura, and thanks everybody for having me. I didn't know I was a special guest star. I would have charged more. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity to be here with such a panel. I'm just going to say very, very briefly, Wireless Philadelphia is the nonprofit organization affiliated with the wireless network being built out in the city of Philadelphia. Super quick update. The network is alive and well. I know a lot of you have followed our work up there. It's about 80% built out, and it has been transferred from corporate ownership by Earthlink to local ownership by a company currently called Network Acquisition Company. We've been teasing them. If they keep that name, there's going to be a lot of other networks out there that they're going to have to buy. But the network is now operating free, and last month had 100,000 unique users using the wireless network in Philadelphia. Wireless Philadelphia, the nonprofit, is particularly focused on digital inclusion, and our purpose is to provide the full complement of access tools that low-income families need to come across the digital divide, and this includes a laptop, broadband, training, technical support, content, and applications, and we try to provide those in the fullest, as a full complement of services under the belief that that's what folks need to really begin to utilize the internet. Just briefly, the last thing I'll say to then hand it over to the other panelists and questions is just to highlight the fact that the digital divide isn't just a rural issue. In the city of Philadelphia, we have 600,000 households. More than 300,000 households have no internet access, and the vast majority of the households that do have access still are in the land of dial-up. So the need for greater bandwidth to bring prices down, increase overall accessibility, the issue with propagation through walls and into higher density spaces is absolutely a real issue as it relates to the mission of digital inclusion in urban areas. So on that note, thank you again, and I look forward to having a chance to answer any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Michael, why don't you, Michael Calabrese from New America Foundation, I'd like to give him a few minutes and talk about some interesting news they have here today. Michael?
Thanks, Maura. I just wanted to, address one of the things that's gone, I think, unsaid today is this, what's coming up is kind of an 11th hour bid by some of the incumbent holders of the spectrum to say, well, this should be licensed and auctioned. Couldn't we raise a lot of money for the government? And, let me tell you the truth about each of those. First of all, if the white spaces are licensed, we would have to leave at least 75% of it unused. And there would be virtually no white space availability in the 20 most populous metropolitan markets. So that means that all of those great benefits for homeowners and businesses that Larry Page and others have been talking about, the ability to buy an off-the-shelf router, plug it in, use it, half the population would not be able to do that at all. And here's why. There's an inherent trade-off between licensing the white space and availability. We've all heard that white space is Swiss cheese spectrum, right? The DTV stations occupy a different pattern of channels depending on which of the nation's 210 local markets you're in. Okay, but the higher the power, the more you have to continue to block channels off as guard bands to protect television. Now, the technology companies that have been up here today, they've proposed using the white space for mobile applications at transmit powers that are below 100 milliwatts. That means that you can use all of the vacant, unassigned channels in each different market. So something like, I think it's 13 channels in Dallas, 19 channels in Boston, et cetera. However, to be useful for a licensed user, the powers would need to be much greater than that. I mean, Wi-Fi now allows powers up to 1 watt. So even at 1 watt, and Qualcomm and the other companies that are talking about licensing admit this, you'd have to block off the adjacent channel on each side of a channel that's licensed. As a result, by market, and this paper that we're releasing today, it's titled "There's No Windfall in the White Space" on the table, demonstrates this. For example, in Dallas, if it was licensed, only channel 29 would be available. There would be, I think, it's either 13 or 19 channels for low-power unlicensed use. Only one channel for licensed is not an adjacent channel, except that channel happens to sit within the protected contour of two other TV stations in neighboring markets, which means there would be no availability. Nobody in the Dallas-Fort Worth area could use the white space at all. And the implication of that, for those who say there's a pot of gold in an auction, is in fact there's not. This would be it would be 2-3 years of delay. We'd have a failed auction like we did with the D block in the 700 megahertz for public safety. There'd be at most a negligible amount of revenue that could ever come from an auction. Qualcomm is claiming, oh, $10 billion, maybe even $20 billion if we don't protect TV viewers at all. They're using the 700 megahertz auction this year, the one that raised over $19 billion as a comparable, but it's simply not true. Like I said, for one reason, you couldn't use the license winners could not operate in the most populous metro markets. So who wants that, business? Okay, so now we're talking about rural providers primarily. They have to operate at very low power anyway, can't cover large areas, which means you need more infrastructure build out. To give you an example, WiMAX operates at 2,000 watts. We're talking about maybe 1 watt here. MediaFlow, Qualcomm's own broadcast mobile video, 50,000 watts, maybe 1 watt here. You can't aggregate the spectrum on the same frequency. That's the Swiss cheese. That means you have to have much more expensive, both not only infrastructure but devices. And finally, there's interference. They wouldn't protect wireless microphones at all, something that Harold Feld will mention. And that's another huge political problem that's totally ignored. So the auctioning idea is just a non-starter, terribly wasteful of spectrum, would be a failed auction, raise almost no money.
Harold Feld from Media Access Project is going to close up the program talking a little about the wireless mic. Oh, I forgot Ben. You're too quiet. You're always too quiet. Let's save the wireless mic stuff for last. Ben Scott is here from Free Press, who's been extraordinarily active in this, and a lot of their activists speaking out on the importance of white spaces in the consumer space and bridging the digital divide. Ben's going to say a few words. Thanks.
Well, I'm not going to spend any time telling you why white spaces are good. If you're still here, you already know, or you're paid to know. What I am going to say is try to be a little bit provocative for those of you who've been working in broadband policy for some years. It's my feeling that if the Commission fails to move white spaces forward, any semblance of broadband policy that you can identify as a coherent strategy in the last 10 years fails altogether. Where did we start with white spaces? What was white spaces intended to be? This is not a flash-in-the-pan idea that came from nowhere. White spaces came from the Powell Commission, from the Spectrum Policy Task Force inaugurated in 2002, to look at how can we allocate spectrum in a way that's more efficient, that can use public resources in a better way to solve the broadband problem. Why was the Spectrum Policy Task Force convened? It was to bring the much sought after and never realized third pipe into the home, to bring broadband competition to the marketplace. The Powell Commission at that time had just finished essentially putting to bed any future of competition in shared access to networks that would have come out of the 1996 Act. The Broadband Strategy 1996 Act was dead. In the early 2000s, the Commission was looking at how can we get broadband competition from somewhere else if it isn't going to be in shared access to our existing infrastructure. And the Commission opened proceedings to open more spectrum, and the Commission looked at broadband over power line, and the Commission looked at how to jumpstart satellite broadband. How have those worked out? They haven't worked out at all. We don't have any competition in the broadband market except for DSL and cable. We're right where we were in 2002. The only thing left that you can even pretend to say is a coherent broadband policy to bring competition in the marketplace is white spaces. And the failure to realize white spaces and to provide wireless broadband to American public in the white spaces means the absolute bankruptcy of 10 years of broadband policy. And I think we should be very careful before we throw it over the side in the interests of not treading on too many political toes, because this is our last chance to make any progress before we start over and try to think about how do we catch up to the rest of the world. The consequences of not succeeding with a white space policy are enormous, and I think have a historical background to them that we should not quickly forget. I'll stop there and hand it off to Harold.
Thank you. Just to wrap things up here very quickly, white space's opponents like to phrase this as broadcasters versus Google or Broadway versus Google, and to say that essentially we are trading away the free over-the-air technology, free over-the-air television that people rely on in exchange for high-tech toys that don't do anyone any good, or that we are going to ruin church services, bring down Broadway, and generally end cultural life as we know it here in the United States. I hope that after this panel we've gotten a sense of what is at stake, but let me put a few faces on this because that's important and shouldn't be lost. In Harlem, uptown from Broadway, Wireless Harlem is using existing Wi-Fi to try to bring broadband access to underserved people of color in those neighborhoods. They are starving for an internet connection in the richest and most competitive market in the United States. And unlicensed spectrum that can be set up cheaply and the cost aggregated among many subscribers is what's bringing it to them. In Chicago, on top of the old Sears Tower in the North Lawndale community, you have a network of high school students and their parents and their teachers who are not only using this for internet access, but for educational opportunities and to actually be the media through internet streaming and through the creation of online content for their local community in partnership with one of their local papers. In the Badlands of San Diego, there's an Indian tribe that didn't have phone service until they started using unlicensed wireless to bring telecommunications technology in, and they now have trained networkers, web developers, and they have turned this not just into a service for themselves, but into a source of revenue in an area that was economically devastated for years. So this is not Broadway versus Google. This is Broadway versus Harlem. This is broadcasters versus the Badlands of San Diego. Now, maybe that is a policy argument we should consider. Maybe we should write off these marginal communities if we somehow got the greater good that way. It's cold, but, you know, we make choices like this all the time. But the real tragedy is we don't even have to make the choice. Testing repeatedly shows that these devices work. And the fact that no sooner is a test concluded when broadcasters and manufacturers of wireless microphones rush out with their template press releases saying that of course it didn't work and of course it failed and this shows that the whole concept is pointless, simply underscore how desperate the people who have a monopoly on this spectrum now are to keep it. They won't even let the FCC testing teams go home to start crunching the data before they're out there to declare failure. If we really care about the future of over-the-air broadcasting and the future of wireless microphones, we do not need to be concentrating on keeping white space devices out. by a happy coincidence, we are about to have to remake the whole wireless microphone industry because they have sold millions of unauthorized devices that are now about to interfere with the commercial spectrum that was bought in the 700 megahertz auction that people paid $20 billion for and that the public safety people are preparing to use. The real battle that is in front of us right now is not Broadway versus Google or even Broadway versus Harlem, but AT&T and Verizon, who bought this spectrum with an expectation to use it, and the public safety people who have been waiting years to get these interoperable systems, trying to figure out how to get into this space without suffering interference and without killing off Broadway and the mega churches. I would suggest that rather than clinging to bad technical arguments, trying to spin out the white spaces indefinitely, and generally wasting everybody's time to no good purpose, that we take the opportunity that is presented by the digital transition and use it as a way to reconfigure the wireless microphone service to one that's available to everyone and that can coexist profitably with authorized white spaces devices. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody, especially all of our panelists who traveled far and wide to be here today. For all of you in the audience for coming and learning about this. We will have all of our panelists available to talk to any of the media here who want to do one-on-ones. Just find us. We're all up here. Lots of interesting things to say, questions to answer. We're here as a resource for you. We're going to unveil as kind of our dessert for this event, the first of the Waya videos. We're very excited to release